Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3 in this A-level year 13 Ecology, Biodiversity and Conservation unit. Today we're talking about succession, so this is applicable to your A-level biology, and if you're a geographer you may have a good idea of what's going on already. Okay, so let's have a look at what it is we're trying to cover today. So here is the syllabus. We're looking at ecosystems as dynamic, changing environments, and the idea that they move in a direction from what we call primary succession, from colonization by these pioneer species, up to what we call a climax community. Right? You need to know that at each stage in a succession, you've got a sort of interaction going on between the abiotic and the biotic factors, where each is influencing and changing the other. Okay? The idea that new species can colonize as environments become more favorable as we move through the pioneer species up to what we call a climax community, and that obviously changes that organisms produced in the abiotic environment result in a less hostile environment that changes biodiversity. Okay, so the focus for today is going to be an awful lot on key words, key definitions, so there might be lots of new terms and ideas, unless of course you're a geographer, in which case you may already know quite a bit of this stuff, in which case good for you. So what I suggest you do is you pause here and draw yourself a table like this, where each time a new term comes up, and I will point them out wherever they come up, you write the new term down, you write a definition, and you write an example. Okay, now I will point out where the definitions are and where the examples are, and so on and so forth. There are some that go above and beyond the syllabus, which obviously is great if you want to write those ones down for the essay that comes at the end of paper 3, which rewards going above and beyond. But most often the exam questions will require you to either do a long answer question, which will require correct use of terminology in the correct order, given a particular example, and I'll give you lots and lots of different examples. They will also require you perhaps to label some diagrams, so it will show you a lot of different diagrams, a lot of different examples of successions in different environments. So first one, for example, to give you the pattern, we're going to do a broad definition of succession on its own. So succession, which is your key term, is the gradual directional change of a community over time. Okay? And there in the background you've got an example. That is a forest fire that is damaging the environment. Okay, so that's damaging the environment, clearing out the environment, and then species will start to recolonize and build back up to the climax community, which in this case was a sort of spruce woodland. Okay, so that's our term, succession, our definition, gradual directional change of community over time, and then our example in this one might be recovery from a forest fire. But there'll be lots of other examples of succession as we go through. So there's broadly two types. Now your syllabus specifically requests that you know about primary succession, even though that's quite rare these days. Now primary succession starts where there is completely bare, lifeless new ground. And that doesn't happen very often on the planet these days. There isn't much new land that crops up that's never had a footprint of life on it at all. More commonly what you see is so-called secondary succession, which is basically where the community is damaged and the soil is left there, or halfway through a succession, and then things recolonize up to a climax community. And it might be the same climax community, it might be a different one, depending on a number of factors like climate change, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's two other key terms for you. Primary succession, starting point is bare ground. Okay, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. Secondary succession, where there's a damaged environment and it builds back up to its climax community. So the forest fire would be an example, a felled woodland, a landslip, something like that. Okay, so those are two key terms. And feel free to pause at any moment and write these key terms down. Okay, the end point of both types of succession is the so-called climax community. So the climax community, the definition is the end point of any succession where no further succession takes place. And in the UK, our climax community is a broad-leafed deciduous woodland. Okay, so something like oak woodland is our climax community. That's stable from then on. Okay, right. So in terms of invading new environments, as we've said, there's two causes of new environments. There's ground clearing that gives us our secondary succession, so landslides, human intervention, natural disasters, etc., and new land forming. Right, volcanic activity and sedimentation would be our examples that we're going to go into. So the top one there, ground clearing, that's quite common. The new land and new space forming is actually quite rare. Okay, the one that's left off there is of course us. We build new blank, lifeless surfaces quite often. So the built environment is the start of a primary succession, okay, to an extent. And we'll get into examples of rocky successions in just a moment, okay? So now your abiotic factors are absolutely vital in how succession works, okay? Because when there's no life there, your abiotic factors, your non-living factors, are all that there is, okay? So by abiotic, I mean non-living things. I'm talking about light, I'm talking about temperature, I'm talking about rainfall, pH, wind speed, wind direction, humidity, all of these different things, extremes in temperature, salinity, changes in the environment, all these things are abiotic factors. They all alter the ability of species to survive in an environment, okay? But the key to succession is to realise that there are always going to be some pioneer species, these first species that go in, that can survive in these extreme abiotic conditions, and they alter the abiotic conditions. So if you have a very, very windy, very, very exposed piece of land and a tree moves in, it provides shelter, it provides shade, it provides fertilizer and nutrients to the soil as it drops its leaves, and it changes those abiotic factors. Okay, so the biotic influences the abiotic and vice versa. Okay, and that's succession, the gradual change in these conditions, abiotic and biotic, over time. Okay, so the key principle that says there, abiotic factors influence what can live in an environment, and organisms, or biotic factors, moving in, change the abiotic factors. Okay, so succession always starts with these crucial organisms called pioneer species, and that's a key term. Pioneer species is the first organism in, these organisms that are adapted to extremes and get in first. Okay, so organisms like pioneer species bring about an alteration in the habitat, a change. Some of them do this more than others, some of them modify the environment more drastically than others, and some are kind of along for the ride. Okay, so they allow new species to colonize the environment in their wake, effectively. They change the environment so it's more suitable for the next stage in the succession. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Now, each of these types of succession has a fancy name. Now, the fancy name comes from what we're starting with. Are we starting with fresh water, salt water, rocks, sand? What are we starting with? So the most basic example, back garden example, would be a pond. So let's say you dug a pond in your garden and put a plastic pond liner in it. That is a lifeless environment to start with. Okay, we call this a hydrosphere. Sphere just means the series that it is part of, and hydro obviously water. Okay, so to start with, maybe from wind or through animals moving through your water or rain, whatever, there might be some green algae, protozoa, some little tiny microscopic organisms that colonize this environment, start photosynthesizing, build up the tiniest amount of biological material in there. Okay, so stage one, they will eventually wilt and die, or they'll die off. Maybe some plants around the edge wilt and die off, fall into the water and decompose. Okay, that adds organic material into your pond. Okay, and creates what we call humus, like a decomposed, very wet organic material. Okay, now here spelling is important, right? Please don't confuse humus, which is our decomposed plant matter, not very tasty at all, with the delicious chickpea dip, hummus, which has a double M. That is a different thing, right? We're not talking about hummus, right? We're talking about humus, okay? The organic matter that falls in the water. Now, that's going to generally sort of amass around the side, as you can see in the diagram in the picture, around the bottom, around the side, and it's going to allow certain plants to move in and grow in that humus as like a basic soil. Okay, so what they're going to do, the marshy zone, as it's so called, this sort of marshy, wet humus is going to get reeds, it's going to get plants, and they're going to have roots. Those roots are going to hold the humus together. They're going to make the soil, the sort of proto-soil, drier. They're going to make it more stable, and other things can then move in. Okay, so stage 4 wise, you then eventually, once that humus has dried out, get herbaceous growth. So that's terrestrial plants. Once the reeds and the marsh plants have stabilised the environment and they've started to draw the water out, create soil, herbaceous terrestrial plants will move in, outcompete the reeds. So the reeds will either have to move into the pond or die out, okay, and the terrestrial plants will move in. So if you have a pond, you know you have to maintain it, or else it fills up with this humus and starts to close up. Right, which is again on your syllabus, the line particularly is sometimes conservation, if you're trying to conserve your pond, involves the management of succession, so the artificial prevention of succession. Because if your pond fills up with this organic material, then all the tadpoles and newts and frogs and things die. Okay, and again, the line from the syllabus there is that ecosystems are dynamic, changing environments. Right? So that's one example, the so-called hydrosphere. This one, the starting point is bare rock. We call that a lithosphere. Okay, you've got bare rock here. Right, that's very, very hard to live on because it's extremes of temperature. There's no soil. The substrate is not good for plants to get their roots onto, to hang onto. It's going to experience extremes of temperature, extremes of water as the sun hits it directly. Right. So, but eventually, after a while, rock will start to weather. Little cracks, little divots will start to fall in it, and things like lichen can actually get a little toehold. Okay. They're particularly adapted extremes, so there are pioneers in this example. Okay, they will obviously get into the little cracks and crevices. They'll start to do what's called biological weathering. They die, provide a tiny little bit of organic material into the rocky surface, which just about allows some mosses to move in. Okay, those mosses act like sponges. They can hold water, they can hold organic material. So you're starting to see the skeleton, the backbone of the soil building up. Okay, you then get the accumulation of more soil and just enough in these cracks, these weatherings for your so-called annual plants to move in. Now, if you've got a patio, you'll know this happens in the cracks and you're constantly trying to get rid of them. That you need a tiny little crack and a tiny little bit of soil, protosoil for things like grasses and dandelions to get into and start to grow there. They obviously die, they decompose, they contribute to the organic material more. Maybe animals, insects, little animals are moving in at this point to feed on the plants, and they're dying and leaving their waste products there, decomposing, adding nitrogen, increasing the soil, and eventually trees and shrubs build up and you get the development of a proper food web. Now, this last picture is from an island off New Zealand. It's a volcanic island, and I like this picture because it shows a lovely sort of progression through a lithosphere. So you can see the volcanic rock pretty much bare at the front, but then as you go towards the back, you start to see more of these larger trees and shrubs moving in. So you can kind of see through distance what a succession would look like over time. Okay. So here's another example of a lithosphere. This is on the Galapagos Islands. These next few are my own photos from when we went there in 2014, took an expedition with students there. And this is me looking across a valley to a cliff face on the other side of the valley. And the botanist we were with pointed this plant out as an example of a plant within the genus Scalesia. Okay, and that's all of them. Not all of them on the cliff face, but all of them in the world. Full stop, all of them. Okay, so that is every one of those particular species of Scalesia that exists on the planet, because the Galapagos is so weird. It's a volcanic island, so it's popped out of the ground, popped out of the sea, right? And that obviously is then a blank environment. That's primary succession, okay, and also doesn't have much genetic material to work with. So specialists have evolved to get toeholds into the environment. So that's a very, very specialist pioneer species in a lithosphere. We could also call it an endemic species if you want proper terms. Bit of an unusual example. This was right at the north tip of San Cristobal, where people aren't allowed to go by land. So some Ecuadorian guides took us up by boat, dropped us off on the beach. We climbed up some hills to see this example on top of the hills, and obviously I was always going to stand on the point of San Cristobal Island in the Galapagos and take a photo of me carefully considering the implications and impacts of succession on biology, because of course every holiday, as we know, is a bioliday. So, moving on. So some common examples of bare rock succession. Urban is increasingly common. So railway lines, slopes, floors of buildings, car parks, this kind of stuff. Increasingly we are causing the starts of lithospheres, or that kind of stuff. Quarrying is one. If we dig a big hole in the ground, get what we want out of it and abandon it, that is a so-called lithosphere. Volcanic islands like the Galapagos being colonised are a really good example, and I'll give you some other examples as well. Now this is a fantastic example, more of secondary succession, but it's in an urban environment. It's a very stark example of succession. So you're probably aware of the Chernobyl disaster, big nuclear disaster, the world's biggest single nuclear disaster that we've seen in an industrial context. And this was in the 80s in the Ukraine. This is a town of Pripyat, which was next to the reactor. and this is it before the 26th of April 1986. Okay, normal looking town, lots of built things, lots of blocks of flats, so on and so forth. Okay, then that happened. That's the hole that got blown in the top of the reactors at the nuclear power station, and everyone left. There was an exclusion zone put up, and literally everybody left because of the radiation as quickly as possible. And of course, radiation was spread across the entirety of Europe. We could detect it here in our agriculture, in our livestock, on our fields. But it did mean a fascinating experiment of what happens if people just disappear. So now, much later, if you go back and look at that same place, it now looks like this. Okay, so an incredible example of a succession on a man-made environment. Okay, in the before and after pictures, in just 30 years, so nature is kind of reclaiming this environment. So that's before and after. And one particularly stark example is this picture. So you can see in the background there, that industrial facility, that is the nuclear facility. Okay, and you can see it was a pretty green town to start with, but then now, 2017, well, it looks like that. Okay, so the trees have largely taken over, largely forested. Things like wolves, deer are moving back in to this man-made environment. And the other feature you can see is what they call the sarcophagus on the top of the nuclear reactor there. So that big sort of metal lid is essentially to try and contain further radiation coming out of the reactor. A fascinating example, right, of a secondary succession in a man-made environment. So a rare example of true primary succession is as follows. Here, this is Surtsey. This is in Iceland. This is an island just off the bottom of Iceland there, so Surtsey. Right? Now, if you don't know why Iceland is throwing up new environments, it's because it's on a gap between the tectonic plates, and it's being ripped apart as America and Europe move apart. So new volcanoes are throwing up new land. And if you go to Iceland, you can go to a place called Silfra, which is a crack between the two, and you can look at the clearest water you'll ever see. It's all glacial meltwater, and if you're so qualified, you can go diving in it, as I did, and you can put your hands on the inside of Europe. So my left hand is on Europe, and my right hand is on the inside of the American tectonic plate. I'm effectively pushing Europe and America apart there. Okay, but that tearing apart means that you get eruptions and you get new volcanic land, and it's a very rare example of primary succession. So this island started 130 metres under the sea, and it broke the surface with a continued eruption, a long-lasting eruption, on the 14th of November 1963, and that eruption stopped, so the volcanic activity finished in 1967. It's a very small island, so it's starting to erode away again now, 2.7 kilometres square, okay? But since 1967, obviously it's been a fantastic laboratory for watching succession. And that's what it looks like now. Okay, so you can see the green starting to creep in. You've got grasses there. We've got nesting birds, puffins, so on and so forth moving in. Okay, and if you look down at it, that is not a very long time for succession to have to build up. Now, obviously, if we left that long enough, you might start to see the environment look more like the mainland of Iceland. Now, I don't think that the island's actually going to be there for that long, because it'll probably erode away and drop back into the sea. So this probably is the example that's most likely to come up on your exam. It's the one that comes up most commonly. It's right, sand dune succession. Okay, and it's what you would see where you're going on field courses. Okay, it's called a Samosea. Okay, Samosea. So I would remember it like Sandosea is how I remember it. Okay, but again, these words are over and above the syllabus. Now that's obviously that's a picture from field course I took in sometime back in 2013 or something like that. This was in Wales, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, as you can see, a beach, very difficult, if you think about it, for a plant to live on. Okay, so it's nearest the sea, and you have very, very few species that can colonise the sand. Okay, in terms of abiotic factors, the reason for that is the sand's constantly shifting, it's blowing around. If you've been to the beach, you know that. Very, very high salinity. Okay, free draining soil. So 1 minute on the tide, you're going to have you're going to be underwater, and then the other end of the tide you're going to be completely dry, and that's going to happen twice a day, every day, so that's pretty extreme. The soil's very, very low nutrients. There's no nitrates, no organic material in the sand for the plant to feed on, so very difficult, right, for organisms to get into. But you do get successions. You do get plants moving in and starting to change the environment, and this is a really famous example of this. This is Wales. This is Harlech. I don't know if you've ever been to Harlech, North Wales. In case you haven't, I'll give you context. So this is where it is in North Wales, and of course, if you need context, this is Wales. It's a country. There it is, right? So Harlech is a town with a castle. It's got Harlech Castle, right? There it is. That was completed in 1289. Okay, and if you can see on the diagram, Harlech Castle is here, right? That was where it was built in 1289 on a nice defensible rock, and the beach is now here, which is about 800 meters away, right, at its shortest point. So it's nearly a kilometre, right, down to the beach. But the amazing thing is, if you go to Harlech Castle, which was completed in 1289, it's got this little gangway out of one of these turrets, this little door, stairs that come down this way, and it's got stairs that drop off the rock to a dock. Okay, they drop it to a dock. This is because when it was built in 1289, it was on the seafront. Okay, and it's now 800 meters, best part of a kilometre, inland. Okay, and that is succession. That's why Harlech is a really good example of sand dune succession. Okay, and of course it's a brilliant place to go for field courses and studying and all that kind of stuff. So you can see there on the top right, students standing in what are called the dune slacks, and students climbing up and down dunes, taking their readings, abiotic factors, so on and so forth. Right, so you are broadly expected to know what the adaptations of organisms are supposed to be, are going to be at the front of a sand dune succession, and what's going to happen as you move back. It's the most common example on exam questions and in textbooks and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get very, very, very specialised species that live in the area. They're called pioneer species, and they show what we call xerophytic and halophytic characteristics. Xerophyte means adapted to low water. Halophyte, for the halogen, means adapted to high salinity. Okay, so there's two key terms for you. You can write those down, and our examples would be sea rocket and sea holly. Okay, now if you've never seen sea rocket, you can eat it. It's not very nice. It's like a very, very salty version of rocket. It's fine. And if any little bit of sort of organic material, debris, seaweed, whatever it is, gets brought in by the tide, dropped at the high tide line, you get just enough nutrients and just enough stability for some sea rocket to put its little roots down. Okay, and just can get a toehold there, right? And that's what's happened there. That's our sea rocket. Okay, you should look after sea rocket because they're very important, as I'm going to explain later. Okay, they create what's called embryo dunes, and this is actually not from Wales, but this is from Cumbria last year, where the Year 13s went on their field course. Okay, and you can see loads of sea rocket down at the front there. So that's a reserve, and that's been protected really nicely. So you can see little tiny bumps where the sea rocket is holding the sand together and the sand's piling up around it. Okay, and that's what we call an embryo dune. Very nice. You've also got this stuff called sea holly. Right, it's another pioneer species of sand dunes. Okay, its Latin name is there. You don't need to know the Latin names. Okay. So these pioneer species give way to other species as you move inland because they're stabilising the sand, they're changing the abiotic conditions, so things like couch grass, which has got widespread roots, can move in, and obviously they're going to then stabilise the sand even more. Right? They're going to absorb and they're going to hold water, for example. Okay? So once they've done that, once you've got stable, moist water, you've got life cycles going on. You get things growing and dying and decaying and so on and so forth. So nutrient levels increase, nitrates increase, water retention improves, and a skeletal soil begins to develop. And that's obviously due to decay of plant material, as we've said, the death and decay of animals, and the decay of seaweed. Okay, and it adds nitrates, phosphates, all the important nutrients into the soil. Okay, so those species further improve what we call the edaphic conditions. Now, edaphic is not a word on your syllabus, but a useful word. It basically means everything to do with the soil. Okay, so that's just soil conditions. So it makes the substrate more hospitable and encourages other species, like the one you probably all think of if you've ever been to the beach, which is called marram grass. Now, marram grass is not actually the pioneer species on sand dunes, as much as many people say that it is. It isn't. It's the things like your sea rocket and sea holly. They allow the marram grass to get a foothold. Okay? It's still a xerophytic organism, and it still massively alters the environment in a way I'm going to tell you in a moment, but it's not the pioneer. It comes second. Okay? And it's that stuff. Okay? The stuff you all think about when you see pictures of sand dunes, right? You've got, these big, long, reedy grasses that you find everywhere. So why is it so good? Why is it so important? Well, it's xerophytic, and if you look at its leaf at the bottom there, that's like looking down. If you cut through the leaf and look down on it, you can see the leaf is actually rolled round on itself with a thick waxy cuticle and ways of keeping all the moisture in. You should know about xerophytic plants from AS Biology. And if you look at this picture over on the right here, you've got where sand dunes have been cut away. You can see just how extensive their root network is and just how well they hold the sand together. They've also got this plastic tissue formation ability, which essentially means that as the sand piles up over them, because obviously if they're in the sand, the wind's going to blow the sand, it's going to pile up over them, they can grow as fast as the sand can pile up. And stuff that was leaf can become root and send out roots in all different directions. So they can be 12, 15 meters deep, right? And if you ever want to keep someone busy at a sand dune, just tell them to go to the top of a dune and dig down and find the bottom of the roots of a marram grass, and they will not be able to do it. They're absolutely huge things. Okay, so large network of roots leading to dune development. Marram grass produces shoots along its stem, ensuring it's never covered with sand, and it leads to large sand dune systems. So as the marram grass gets bigger, the sand dune gets bigger, the marram grass gets bigger, the sand dune gets bigger, and we get what we call these big yellow dunes. Now, of course, if you think what happens behind those yellow dunes, the wind speed's going to be lower, the temperature's going to be warmer, you're going to get less salt and spray from the sea. So already we're changing the abiotic conditions quite drastically just due to our pioneer species and then the marram grass. Okay, so in the first, what we call dune hollow, you end up with very, very different conditions and lots of different species able to move in. So we call them yellow at this point because they're still predominantly sand. Right, so there's marram grass in there, predominantly sand. They haven't got very much organic material in them. As things break down and rot, starts to look more like soil. So the colour of the dunes gets darker as you go back. Okay, so the substrate will eventually turn grey as levels of dead material increase. Okay, and you start to get other creatures like this. Now these are still seashore specialists. Okay, but they couldn't live right at the front. They need the help from the dune formation of the marram grass. So once you get behind the first dune, you start to see some other species. Now these ones, you will do lessons on nitrogen fixation, the nitrogen cycle in a little while, so if you're not sure on this yet, don't worry about it, but things like rest harrow, bird's foot trefoil, things like that have the ability to fix nitrogen due to a symbiosis with a bacteria into the soil. Okay, so they add nitrogen which helps other creatures, helps other organisms move in, so they enrich the soil. Okay, you get this stuff. Okay, as nitrogen levels increase, other species become more common. So this is red fescue. You see this on most beaches, literally just after the first, or top of the first dune and back, you'll see red fescue. They species stabilize the substrate even further. Okay, so they hold on to that nutrient, stabilize it, start to bring in, because they produce flowers, start to bring in insects. Insects die and decompose, and so on and so forth. Okay, and there it is from last year's trip to Cumbria. Okay, that's our example there. As you move back and go over a number of the dunes, they go from yellow dunes to grey dunes, and then eventually you start to get such low amounts of wind and such increased temperature and increased soil that the dunes start to flatten out into what's called dune slacks, which hold water really well because there are loads of roots in them. You get lots of wildflowers growing, right, and they're very moist, very damp, kind of boggy, kind of underfoot. Okay, and then eventually the bigger things like bushes, shrubs, all that kind of stuff are able to move in. Okay, that we call a subclimax community. So the definition of a subclimax community is, in the UK, is shrubs, woody plants. It's the community you get before you then get forest most of the time. Okay, it's a subclimax community. Shrubs and woody growth, and then at this point, quite often, we're going to talk about intervention in the next lesson. If humans intervene, what you get is what we call a plagioclimax. Again, that is a beyond the syllabus word, but it's a good one to know. So plagioclimax is where we stop a succession, and we go, that is the artificial top of a succession. Okay, a planted woodland, for example, right? If we've planted wood to chop down, agroforestry, that kind of stuff, that's a plagioclimax. And actually, if the camera here were to pan a little bit to the right, you would see that that's what we've got in North Wales. Okay, at Harlech, there's a plantation of spruces just behind, which are chopped down for forestry for wood. Okay, So subclimax community is the stuff you get before. So you go from wildflowers, these dune slacks, this sort of wet environment, to more shrubs, bushes. You know what these things look like in the UK. Think a typical UK hedge, those kind of shrubs. And then eventually, if you left that long enough, the ultimate UK climax community would be oak woodland. Things like oak, beech, birch, ash, all these ones would move in, okay? And they would grow, they're broad-leafed, and they're deciduous, meaning they drop their leaves in the autumn. Okay, so this is clearly spring because the bluebells are growing underneath it. Broad-leafed deciduous woodlands, and that is the climax community for the UK. Now that actually is a lower biodiversity environment than our subclimax community. Okay, and if we're going to talk next lesson about preserving biodiversity, well, then actually we do have to do something to make sure that we have a mixture of not entirely climax, subclimax, and various other ones as well. Because as these plants take over, they squeeze out all of your rest harrows, and certainly your pioneer species are long gone by this point because they just can't compete. So at the front of our succession, abiotic factors are king, and as we move back, biotic factors become the deciding factor on survival. Okay? So as I say, there's our UK climax community, and that will be different in other environments. In Central America or the tropics, it might be tropical rainforest. In the Arctic, well, it'd be very different again. In Australia, it'll be eucalyptus woodland, so on and so forth. Okay? So in summary, this is basically what's happened. And the reason sand dunes are so good is because you can actually look at what would happen in sort of an 800-year succession, right? We don't have to wait for the land to change. We can actually see each stage in the succession just by moving back along a transect. Okay, so in theory, that embryo dune there, if you leave it long enough, will become a foredune, will become a yellow dune, will become a grey dune, a dune slack, and then a forest. And in that meantime, the land will push out into the sea and put human structures from the medieval period further and further inland. Obviously, that's quite a long field trip if we try and watch a piece of sand. Right? So actually, these are why sand dunes come up so often on your exam. Okay, so as you go back, you go embryo dune, fore dune, yellow dune, grey dune, dune slack, and then into our subclimax, climax community from heath and into woodland. Okay, so at the bottom there you can see what's happening. The pH is decreasing because the soil's becoming richer, the organic matter is increasing, and you can think about all the different abiotic factors that are changing as well. Okay, so that's essentially how succession works. Now, the next lesson is on conservation, okay, because conservation involves maintaining biodiversity, that's, as we're going to discuss, and if you're in the lesson in the AS level, succession pushes towards one climax community. It's not necessarily very diverse, okay, and sometimes if we want to maintain biodiversity in our very human impacted environment, we actually have to stop succession, and there are different ways to do that, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. Okay, and on the subject of conservation, just a heads up, big things, big projects. I've been working away behind the scenes on something really big, which is coming. I'd like to talk to you about conservation. Okay, thanks very much.